everyone. It's a heavy morning to start. I hope that through our learning, we'll be able to get a little bit more hope and perhaps a little bit more inspiration. Although those that know me know that my teaching can be quite heavy as well, but I'll try as much as possible to bring some light in. So as you can see from the title, today I want to speak about the idea of covenant, crisis, and agency in the Purim story. And what I want to do is to unpack what I see as three moments of crisis. Totally different, coming from very different angles. And when I say crisis here, I mean theological crisis. I mean the crisis of a crisis that happens when I face a moment, or there is a moment in history in which something happens to break my basic belief and basic faith that I have had until that moment. And there's three different things that I brought for you. If you look, the first three sources. One is Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived a few centuries ago, and he kind of, I guess, the continuation from Benedict Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, who in his Tractus Theologico Politicus in 1642 came out with a very strong argument against revelation, against the idea that there is some kind of revelatory God that exists in the world. And Friedrich Nietzsche puts a final nail in the coffin about 200 years later in his, it's not actually called The Death of Gods. I don't know why I put that as the title. It's called Zarathustra, so it has another title. And in that book, he essentially speaks about the idea that as a society, we have killed God. Now, clearly he was speaking in a metaphorical sense, but people took it very literally. And people essentially said, and what happened, what followed from Nietzsche, was that God, we don't need God anymore. And very, very soon afterwards, we had the continuation of the Enlightenment philosophers, Descartes and Immanuel Kant, and many after that, who, even though many of them, you should know, were religious and believed, they weren't atheists, they believed in God, but their philosophy led to a general outlook that essentially dispelled any intimations of revelation, meaning any idea that there is some kind of metaphysical realm that we need to be aligned with. That's the first crisis, and it was a general crisis. It was a crisis in humanity in which there was a total disengagement from something transcendent, from the idea of maybe mystery, from the idea that there's a transcendent realm, from the idea that there's a God, from the idea that there's some kind of divine authority. And that began with Friedrich. So that was the one crisis. The second crisis happened, and this is more particular to Judaism. In 1966, a Jewish theologian called, he was also a Reform rabbi, called Richard Rubinstein, opened the floodgates for Holocaust theology when he wrote the book after Auschwitz. There had not been very much, or there had almost been no response to the Holocaust from within mainstream Judaism, philosophical response to the Holocaust. The only exception, there was the Satmar response, which leaned very heavily on the idea of blaming the Zionists. But besides for that, there was very little response. 1956, I'm going to bring it in a bit later, Rav Soloveitchik writes Kol Dovi Dofek, or he gives a lecture and then it's written, Fate and Destiny. That's kind of a response to the Holocaust, but it's not truly a proper theological response. And then in 1966, we have Richard Rubinstein. And Richard Rubinstein uses the same Nietzschean language. And he essentially argues that we cannot possibly believe in a God that would allow such a thing to happen to the Jewish people, and therefore God is dead. Same language as Nietzsche, but this time it's very particular to the Jewish destiny. It's very particular to the Jewish people. Now, of course, there was a mass counter response to Richard Rubenstein, which we're not going to get into now, but throughout this class, we'll try and understand. The third, and here we're going back to the times of the Bible. The third is also a moment of crisis. And this moment of crisis actually is very similar to Friedrich Nietzsche and very similar to Richard Rubenstein. It's just termed in more biblical language. And I'll read for you what this moment of crisis was. The people of Israel had come out, they were slaves, they had come out of Egypt, and they were wandering in the desert. They had had all these miracles. God had revealed himself. They had stood, God had opened the sea, God had done all the plagues, the makot. Moshe had led them out, and all of a sudden they find themselves abandoned in the wilderness. And God isn't revealing himself every single second. Yes, they have the Anan. Yes, they have the man, but God isn't constantly doing miracles. And all of a sudden they start crying out, "We are thirsty. We want to drink." And I'm going to read for you what happens. And God, what happens when they cry out, "We want to drink. We want to drink. We want water." There's no water. What does Moshe do? He hits the rock, and from the rock comes water. And at the end of the whole episode, we're told that the place is called Masa or Meribah. Ariv b'nei Yisrael v'nisotam et Hashem lemor. Hayesh Hashem b'kilbenu im ayin. The reason why it's called Masa Meribah is because the people of Israel quarreled with God, and they tried him, saying, "Is Hashem..." Now, classic translation is Hashem amongst us? We know but the word bikirba, we see also in the episode with Sarah, really means within. Is God within us or not? V'yavo Amalek v'yilachem im Yisrael. Immediately following this crisis, Amalek comes. Why do I say that this is a third crisis in the same guise as the crisis of Nietzsche, which is a general crisis of transcendence, and the crisis of Richard Rubenstein, which is a particular crisis of Jewish revelation of the idea of God revealing himself? Why? Because the people are asking the same question. Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin. Is God within us and God amongst us? Where's God? Where is God? If God isn't revealing himself all the time, if he's not present, that we can see him, if he's not tangible, if we can't prove him, then why should we believe he's alive? In fact, if we as human beings are so autonomous and so free, right, surely we are the only ones that matter. Now, the crisis of the people of Israel is slightly different, because here, what they're really asking is, we saw God do all these miracles and now he's disappeared. And what is God calling the people to do? Why do they have to battle Amalek immediately after this? Because the answer to the question, is God within us, is yes, he is. Because every single one of you is created in the image of God. And every single one of you can fight God's battles. And that's why immediately after they have to fight the battle of Amalek. Now, again, these are three different crises. Yes, they all have similarities. They also all have differences. What I want to show you throughout the shir today is a response to each crisis. And I want to show it to you from the prism of the Purim story. Why Purim acts as the paradigmatical moment in Jewish history in which the people of Israel accept the Torah. And more than that the people, it is a tool, it is a mechanism, it is an inspiration for us at the moments of crisis that we're going to face in the future. And one of them is today. One of them is today. Thank God, Baruch Hashem, we are living in the golden, I always say this, let's remind ourselves, we're living in a golden age. We have, for the first time in thousands of years, a state that is our own. For the first time in thousands of years, we are living as independent people in our ancient land. We are walking the roads that our ancestors walked thousands and thousands of years ago. We have created a state. We are sitting in a Bet Midrash filled with books from our past, and we are learning Torah of the present. There cannot be a better moment than this. And yet, we are very much in a moment of crisis, a crisis of leadership, a crisis of unity, a crisis of our people. And the question is more than that. What can we do? Where do we have a precedent of how to act? And again, I go back to this question that I'm asking. When there is a crisis, and here we're talking more theological, today we're also talking theological, and we're also talking sociological and spiritual. What mechanism, what tool, right? What gift in some ways has God given us in order to know how to act? And what I want to show you is that Purim really is one of those moments in which we learn what we have. And the answer is in the title of your question, in the title of the shiur. The answer is covenant and agency. What do I mean by those two things? I can see some of you smiling because you know me already, right? You can almost guess where I'm going, right? Covenant and agency are the two fundamental pillars through which we find the strength within ourselves to respond to crisis. Okay, let's begin. Response to crisis one. The death of God. Friedrich Nietzsche turns around and says, God is dead because he's not revealing himself. We can't see him. We can't prove him. People have taken on autonomy for themselves. Oh, by the way, I didn't actually read sources 1 and 2. Whoops. Okay, let me read what Friedrich Nietzsche says. He gives it as a parable of the madman. And by the way, Friedrich Nietzsche himself went mad at the last 10 years or 15 years of his life. He went clinically, I don't know how you call it in politically correct language, but insane. Yeah, I guess that would be the word. And many people say, well, there's a lot of theories of why, but this is what he says. The madman jumped into the midst and pierced them with his eyes. Whither is God, he cried. I will tell you, we've killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how do we do this? Look at his language. How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What are we doing when we unchain this earth from its sun? Okay, Friedrich Nietzsche, everyone thinks that he was the one that brought the theory that God is dead. Actually, if you read it carefully, it's a critique. It's a critique of those people who have killed off God. And Friedrich Nietzsche here is saying, the minute we lose the realm of transcendence, the minute we disconnect ourselves from anything transcendent, we've wiped away the horizon. We've wiped away mystery. We've wiped away the sun, the sea, all of these things that create awe. Awe is transcendence. Awe is the recognition there's something bigger than myself. Friedrich Nietzsche is saying we've wiped all of that away because we're only focusing on the I, on the here and the now. Whither is it moving? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backwards, sideways, forwards, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? God's too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. And by the way, he continues and he says, I didn't bring it for you, but he continues and he says, how are we going to comfort ourselves with the vacuum that's been created when we killed off God? And he argues, he says, will we have to become gods ourselves? And many people say that he was almost prophetically saying, he didn't know what would be 100 years later, but he was almost predicting what was going to be in the Holocaust 100 years afterwards, whereby the minute you kill off transcendence, the minute you don't believe that there's an authority greater than yourself, and man becomes his own authority, anything is possible. And Friedrich Nietzsche almost warned us that that would happen. Richard Rubinstein has a very different argument to Nietzsche, but uses his language. If I believed in God as the omnipotent author of the historical drama and Israel as its chosen people, I had to accept Dean Gruber's conclusion that it was God's will that Hitler committed 6 million Jews to slaughter. I could not possibly believe in such a God, nor I could believe in Israel as the chosen people of God after Auschwitz. Richard Rubenstein, I want to be very clear here, says, if I think very logically about God and the chosen people of Israel, and I say that we are God's chosen people and God allowed this to happen and everything happens because God wants it and wills it to happen, then I have to conclude that God willed 6 million Jews to die. And if I conclude that, I cannot believe in my God. And therefore, God is dead. However, Richard Rubenstein continues, in order for us to survive once again in that vacuum, the vacuum that Friedrich Nietzsche described, the vacuum where there's no transcendent and no mystery and nothing left for me to cling onto to provide meaning in my life, says Richard Rubenstein, I need to hold tight to community, to ritual, to religion, not because it has any intrinsic value and not because it has any metaphysical truth, but rather because I need it, otherwise I'm going to fall into the abyss. Okay, 3 crises. And by the way, the people of Israel, when they say, Hayesh Hashem b'kilbenu im ayin is what? Or ayin is nothingness, or nothingness. The people are literally stating Friedrich Nietzsche and Richard Rubenstein's dilemma. If God isn't amongst us, and if God isn't within us, then what is there left? Nothingness, an abyss, a vacuum. What does God do? He forces them to fight Amalek. Why? Because Amalek is the quintessential representation of nothingness, of fate, of non-meaning. And they have to fight non-meaning. Okay, 3 crises. The response to crisis 1. I'm reading you the Rambam in source number 4. If man's actions were done under compulsion, the commandments and the prohibitions of the law would be nullified, and they would also be absolutely in vain, since man would have no choice in what he does. The truth about which there is no doubt is that all of man's actions are given over to him. If he wishes to act as he does, and if he does not wish to act as he does, there is no compulsion whatsoever upon him. Hence, it necessarily follows that commands can be given. In order to understand the answer to our 3 theological crises, what we have to do is to find answers from theology. And one of the answers very clearly is the Rambam. Rambam turns around and he says, we cannot possibly be given the laws if we're not free. And in order for us to truly be free, what does it mean? And I remind you of the very, very famous midrash that we have in Talmud Shabbat that says, when God gave us the Torah on Mount Sinai, he held it over our heads, and we weren't really free to get it, right? Whereas in the time of Achashverosh, we were truly free because God was hidden. And the Rambam is saying exactly the same thing. The Rambam is turning around and saying to Friedrich Nietzsche, okay, and to Baruch Spinoza and all the others, okay, it's true, God isn't revealing himself like he did in the time of the Tanakh. We don't see constant revelation, but the reason for that is because what? Because if God revealed himself all the time, we would be compelled to keep the law. And if we're compelled to keep the law, then we're not free and we're not doing it properly. It's not authentic. That's what the Rambam says. That's what the Agadah in Talmud Shabbat is telling us. We had the mountain over our heads because at the end of the day, we couldn't go back to Egypt. We had to accept the Torah. We didn't really have a choice. But when did we have a choice? In the time of Esther, when Dafka God was hidden. Dafka, he wasn't revealing himself. And there was a very real threat of crisis that the people would say, no, the death of God, he abandoned us, we're in exile, maybe he doesn't exist anymore. We'll just adopt the Achashverosh's rituals and laws, and we don't need to maintain our Jewish identity because we don't believe in God. And the Rambam is very clear about this. Martin Buber, and I want to go back to a minute to Friedrich Nietzsche. A lot of the God is dead and a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers, Immanuel Kant and various other people, What they really were trying to do, almost what they did do, and by the way, it was also connected at the time to the Darwinian biology and many other things, science, and the idea of science and how science became one of the orienting paradigms that people followed. The idea was that ultimately, we don't need God. That's why Friedrich Nietzsche said, we killed God off, we don't need him, right? And why? He's not revealing himself, there's no revelation, we don't see him. And therefore, ultimately, we can kill him off, and we can become the ones that everything stops, the buck stops with the human being. Everything stops with us. We are in charge of our reality. We are able to create everything from moral law to science, to everything that we need in this existence, everything that we need and we want, we can create on our own. Following that, we have what we in Judaism, or in Jewish philosophy, we have what we call the dialogical philosophers. And they turned around, and here I'm talking about Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig, later on Avraham Yoshua Heschel, Emmanuel Levinas. Can everyone make sure on Zoom to put your microphone on mute? So, okay. They turned around and they said as follows. They said it's true, God does not reveal himself anymore. God does not reveal himself anymore. However, God still does reveal himself, just not in the ways that we're used to, not in the biblical ways that he's coming and doing miracles every moment. Revelation, transcendence, connection with God comes through an encounter. For Martin Buber, it was the I Thou encounter. For Franz Rosenzweig, revelation came through the star of redemption in the present moment. For Emmanuel Levinas, it came through the face-to-face encounter. For Avraham Yoshua Heschel, it came through radical amazement. Every single one of them turned around and took Nietzsche to task. And they said, this is not the era of the death of God. God is more present than ever. It's just that he has to be hidden so that we can act, as the Rambam says, as free moral agents. Look at source number 5. Revelation is nothing less than the relation between giving and receiving. The law is not thrust upon man, and listen to what he says. It lies deep within him. Remember what the people of Israel say by Meriva? Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin, is God within us? Martin Buber responds not here just to Friedrich Nietzsche. He's responding here also to the third crisis we looked at, which was the crisis of Meriva. And he's saying to the people that the law, God, transcendence, revelation, it's not just something external out there. It's something deep within here. To awaken when the call comes, my own belief in revelation does not mean that I believe in finished statements about God were handed down from heaven to earth. Rather, it means that human substance is melted by the spiritual fire which visits it. And there now breaks forth from it a word, a statement, which is human in its meaning and form, human conception and human speech, and yet witness to him who stimulated it and his will. What Martin Buber is saying here is exactly the response that God gives to the people of Israel. Martin Buber is responding to Nietzsche. God responds to the people of Israel. They're both asking the same question. If God isn't revealing himself all the time, then where is he? And how can we believe in him? God responds to that question by sending them to fight Amalek. Martin Buber responds to Nietzsche's question by saying God isn't out there in finished propositional statements or open revelation. God is in here. God is in the acts that we do, the kindness that we show, keeping the halakha, retaining our tradition, interpreting the law. That's where God is, says Martin Buber. God turns around to the people of Israel at Mei Merivah and says to them when they ask, where is God? Is there just nothingness in the world? Is there no meaning anymore because God's not revealing himself? And he responds by saying, go and fight Amalek. Why? To show them that you really want to find where God is. Look into yourself. Selem Elokim. your agency, your ability to fight for good in this world, to fight against nihilism, against non-meaning, against the Amalekian philosophy of fate, that's where God is. I'm going to continue. And here I brought you a very, very long source. I don't usually, especially in Yemei Iyun, bring such a long source from one author, but I could not bring it because it is the essence of everything I'm trying to say. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, and I really felt I had to bring him here. I usually bring a lot of Sachs in Yemei Iyun. I will bring Rabbi Sachs at the end, but this year I had to bring this in. And it's an unpublished manuscript, and I thank Rabbi Greenberg for allowing me to use it. It's called The Triumph of Life. Please, God willing, very soon it will come out. It will be his magnum opus. Will be the most incredible book, and everybody here will read it because it will be an absolute must. In the book, those of you that know, I wrote my doctorate on him as well. In this book, The Triumph of Life, he explains to us that Judaism goes through 3 different eras: the biblical era, the rabbinic era, and the modern era. And in each era, there is a reframing of the covenant and the way in which the covenant works and the way in which we engage with God. In the biblical era, God was open, there was open revelation. We saw him, we heard him, we walked with him, mitalech began, he was there all the time. After the Churban, or just before the Churban, God, and he turns everything on his head. He says, Dafka, when God begins to samsem et atzmo, he uses the concept of simtsum, which is a Kabbalistic concept of God contracting himself. Rabbi Greenberg says that this is a call to human beings to take on a greater role in covenant. Covenant, Brit, is the very basis of our relationship with Hashem. It's where we work with God to fix the world. Not that we wait for God to come down and create miracles, and not that we say, oh, it's all us. It's a combination of hubris and humility. It's a combination of us and God working together for Tikkun Olam. And Rabbi Greenberg says that in the first period, it was more God. God did much for humanity. But even if we look at the Torah, the Tanakh itself, it begins in Gan Eden, where we see God manifest the entire time. And it ends with Megillah Esther, where we see God is not mentioned at all. Why? Because human beings have taken on a greater role in their covenantal journey. Look at what he says. The rabbis called our attention to a divine cosmic movement, a self-contraction that was meant to and actually did evoke human response. The rabbis taught us the covenant was not a fixed structure, but an organic relationship that developed and matured in the course of history. In the first stage of covenant, God saves humans from the fruits of weakness or folly, or punishes them directly for violations. The rabbis understood that by shrinking the limits of divine intervention, I've obviously cut and pasted a lot of stuff, right? In nature and history, God had established a more naturalistic course of history. This is what Spinoza says. Spinoza jumps on this trajectory and he says, oh, it means that God doesn't exist. But what Rabbi Greenberg is saying here is no, the opposite. God becomes more naturalized in order to hand human beings greater agency. And as Rambam says, that's the highest level. If we don't have agency, we can't possibly be partners in the covenant, okay? The goal was the same, redemption, Eden, but the age of visible miracles, interventions that reverse the course of natural history was over. In tandem, the age of God working through hidden and more natural miracles had begun. The good news was that henceforth humans would be co-partners in Tikkun Olam and co-creators of the unfolding Torah, which would guide life in every age. The bad news that with human judgments and reckless behavior, especially when they led to confrontation with the world's mightiest imperial power, Rome, led to greater catastrophe and more permanent exile. It is not a matter that God did not care, or was abandoning human Israelites to their fate. And I remind you of Richard Rubinstein, okay? One should not forget that in taking humans to higher levels of partnership, the divine was coming closer and sharing this fate. God was accepting a higher level of divine suffering during the longer duration of evil and pain that would go on in an unredeemed world. But God embraced this cost as the price of the path to human maturation of growth into a full image of God, i.e. a human that would be fully free, not dependent and equal, not intimidated in the covenant. Without the capacity to develop new sources of revelation, the people would have perished for lack of guidance. And here he's specifically talking about the rabbinic era. In the rabbinic era, what the rabbis did was revolutionary. absolutely revolutionary. They reframed Judaism. Until the exile, Judaism was a religion of the priests. And all of a sudden, after the exile, it becomes a religion of the rabbis. And we know a few very famous texts in the Talmud, Lo b'shamayim hi, right? We don't listen to Bakol. We don't listen to heavenly voice anymore. Why? Because the law's down here with us, right? Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These are the words of living God. It's about dialectic. It's about conversation. It's about dialogue. It's about interpretation. It's about human vision of a divine law, but a human vision of a divine law. And that is what Rabbi Greenberg is saying here. When rabbis basically took Judaism to the next level, they understood that the human being had to have a more aggressive and more central role in the covenantal relationship between humans and God. God was calling us to become the higher partner in the covenant. If we try to understand the absence, then in confronting a catastrophe of equal or greater scope in this century, we must walk in the footsteps of the rabbi. If we try to understand the absence of expected intervention in this century, and again here he's responding to Richard Rubenstein, we must think no less boldly. We have to go back, as the rabbis did, and detect a divine signal hitherto overlooked, that the covenant partner is calling again to a new level of human engagement with the benefit of a painfully earned hindsight. I would argue that an additional Tzimtzum preceded the Shoah. In retrospect, the new higher calling was the intended message of modernity. Meaning what? Modernity preceded the Shoah. Friedrich Nietzsche, Descartes, Kant, Hume, all of those philosophers, what did they detect? They detected, and by the way, the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, we can go on and on and on, the Reformation, on and on and on. But what we see from all of these things, all of these ideas, is that the human being becomes the central axis through which we determine our reality. What Rabbi Greenberg is saying, and then obviously we can say the death of God, the death of transcendence, the death of revelation, the death of anything beyond. Rabbi Greenberg saying the opposite. This was the call of God for human beings to take on a higher role in the covenantal process. And we didn't hear it, because what did we say? We said, Hayesh Hashem b'kilbenu im Iyun. Is God really with us? Is God within us? Is God amongst us? There's really nothingness. There's nothing, no meaning in this world. There's no transcendence. And Dafka, what we should have heard was that because we have a higher role, because we have everything at our fingertips, we can bring more transcendence into the world. We can do God's purpose. We can fulfill God's purpose in the world more than we ever could before. We can cure hunger, and we have means by which to cure disease, and we have means by which to make life more meaningful, dignified, and equal. All of these things are what God's calling us to do, and we didn't hear. God was summoning human beings to take full responsibility. I would describe it as managerial responsibility for the covenantal goal of Tikkun Olam. God, as the master teacher of humanity, saw humans on the brink of an unparalleled development of capability. Mortals were about to develop a human science and analysis that would raise humans to a fuller realization of their godlike capacities. Therefore, God renewed the covenant. Again, this entailed a divine self-discipline to be even less visible and not manage history directly, not even through hidden miracles. I'm going to skip. Unfortunately, in response to the modern Tzimtzum, the traditional leadership chose immobilism and cultural withdrawal. Instead of seeing increased hiddenness as a summons to see and hear God on other levels, they denied the new mode of God's presence and acted as if nothing changed. The liberal, so that's on one side, he's talking obviously about the more traditional Haredi communities. The other side, the liberal religious Jews, were much more favorable to modern culture. They saw modernity when applied to religious behavior as a summons to curtail observance in favor of broader faith principles. But on the other side, the liberal Jews turned around and said, we don't need to keep all of those laws anymore. We don't even necessarily need to believe in God. We can have a cultural Judaism, right? Or as Richard Rubenstein says, we need the community and we need some of the rituals. We can get rid of some of the others. Ultimately, it's just about creating human meaning. So both ends didn't hear the call. One might say that both sides in this internal argument missed the deepest message. The age of hidden miracles was over, and the age of human miracles was beginning. Megillat Esther is about a human miracle. It is about a human battle. And I'm going to show you where, but that was the beginning. That is the prototype. That is the paradigm that we need to keep going back to. I'm going to go to in other words, here he speaks about Purim. In responding to Purim, in recognizing that God was now hidden and doing only hidden miracles, in understanding that the Jews had to take much more action to enable the right results and had to take heightened responsibility for their actions, the Jews had renewed the covenant on the new terms. This covenant was not coerced by visible miracles and guaranteed rewards and punishments. In effect, the Jews had connected to the covenant partner at a higher level. They committed to serve God out of more selfless motives and out of a deeper relationship to God for its own sake. This was indeed not just a renewal, but a maturation of the covenant. This understanding and maturation of the human role in covenant is critical to the interpretation of this central mechanism of the Jewish religion. It shows that covenant is not a one-time event or a fixed legal code revealed at one point in Jewish history. Rather, Brit is a dynamic relationship between God and Israel. While the love that drives this relationship has proven to be steadfast and unconditional, strong enough to survive great failures and great shocks in Jewish history, it is not fixed. The sustaining emotion has enabled the partners to grow together and to deepen and renew the ongoing relationship. So the response to crisis one is a response that turns around and says, Richard Rubinstein, at crisis one being Friedrich Nietzsche, and also Richard Rubinstein to a degree, although Richard Rubinstein will see a response in a minute. The response to crisis one of Friedrich Nietzsche is the idea, just because humans have become more capable, and just because humans see only what's here in the here and now, and don't look beyond her transcendent world, just because humans want to kill off mystery and kill off God, it doesn't mean that that is the only way of responding to human agency and to the adoption of human agency. On the contrary, if we want humans to be strong, if we want humans to achieve what they've achieved over the last 2 centuries, more than anything, we need God, because we need to know that God is actually within us, that the drive, that the innovation, that the creativity that we have as human beings comes from a divine source. And we are not given all of these things stun so that our lives can be amazing. No, we're given these things in order to fulfill God's mission in the world. That is the covenantal call of the third era. And that is a response to Friedrich Nietzsche. Response to crisis 2. Yeah. Sorry.
I'm not a very big thought. That is some very, very lame excuse for the terrible things that happened in the Holocaust.
We haven't got to the Holocaust yet.
And I mean, what happens today? I mean, today, if you say we've got to take more agency or things like that, it's a terrible price to pay.
It's a massive price to pay for our freedom, a huge price to pay for freedom. But the mechanism in which we're looking at the idea of covenant, first we see it, it's clear from the Tanakh itself. God wants to hand human beings agency. The whole of the Megillah Esther, which we're going to see now, the entire Megillah could have gone the other way. There is a turnaround moment in the Megillah where Mordechai from the beginning understands that something needs to be done, but Esther doesn't. And if it wasn't for the fact that at that moment he convinces Esther, who knows what would have happened? But the entire Megillah seems to be played out in the hands of human beings. And yes, God is clearly overseeing it, but from the literal reading of Megillah, God's not there. And there's a lot to say on this. It's a much bigger topic. Let me get to responding to the third crisis, which is the Holocaust. And we'll see how, because there I want to use a different paradigm. Here I'm using Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg less as a response to Richard Rubinstein and more as a response to Friedrich Nietzsche. And it's showing you that that crisis of the death of God doesn't necessarily need to lead to that answer. what Yitz Greenberg is telling us here is that there's another way in which we can respond to it, and that is to see it as God handing us a managerial role in the covenant, which means that he's more hidden, but actually closer than ever before. Okay. What happens in terms of the problem of evil and the Holocaust, we'll get to in a second. Response to crisis 2. So what happens? They have to fight Amalek. And I'll remind you, if you look back to source number 3, they're the people are on the ground, okay? And Joshua is fighting on the ground with the people, and Moshe goes to the top of the mountain, and he holds his hands in the air, and he has on either side Aaron and Hur, who support his hands, and his hands are what we call Yudei Emunah. Yudei Emunah, we could say, is the hands of faith, but really Emunah means covenant, it means trust, it means loyalty, it means understanding there's a relationship between two people. And when his hands went down, the people were unsuccessful. When they went up, they were successful. And the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah tells us that the reason why that isn't because it was a miracle. On the contrary, when the people saw Moshe's hands raised to heaven, their hearts were raised to heaven. And that gave them the inspiration to fight Amalek. When we understand that our actions here down on earth as human beings, in all our capacity, when we understand that we are connected to something transcendent, then we will win the battle against fate. Amalek represents fate. He represents a certain outlook of nothingness, of non-meaning. And when we have an element of transcendence in our actions, we connect with something bigger than ourselves. Not only are we being human beings with all our capacities down here on earth, we're also bringing the divine image down to earth with us. Look at what happens in sources number 8. We have the turnaround in the Megillah. And again, this is the moment in which we see the response to this idea of nothingness. לעבדה. ועת פתקשן כתב הדת אשר ניתן בשושן להשמידם, נתן לו להראות לעת אסתר ולהגיד לו, לצוות עליה לבוא אל המלך, להתחנן לו, לבקש מלפניו על המה. He asked Esther, and he says, we're in a crisis. The people are about to be killed. We're about to be killed. I'm asking you to go and beg the king. And Esther comes back and says to Mordechai, everybody knows that if I go to the king now, I haven't gone for 30 days, I'm not going to be able to go. And she basically, what does she say? I'm passive, I can't do anything, there's nothing I can do, this is the fate, this is what's meant to be, it's out of my control. Okay, and then Mordechai turns around and says as follows in Pasuk Yud-Bet, V'yigidu leMordechai devrei Esther, v'yomer Mordechai l'ashiv el Esther, al titami b'nafshech lihimaleh bet hamelech mikol haYudim. Do not imagine that you can hide away in the house of the king. Ki im acharesh tachrishi be'et hazot, if you deafen yourself at this time, if you don't hear the call, then Mordechai believes so deeply that redemption will come from another place. But you and your house, you'll be destroyed. Who knows? Mordechai is living in a time whereby there is no open revelation. There is no Urim V'Tumim, there are no prophets, there's no one to tell us what is going on. We do not know why things are happening the way they are. And again, I remind you of the periods we're living in today, which is a period of uncertainty. It feels chaotic. It feels as if everything's falling around us. And we say to ourselves, mi yodea, we don't know. We don't know what the solution is here. We don't know how we're going to bring hope back to the people, bring unity back to it. How are we going to do it? Mordechai says, I don't know anything, but what I do know, says Mordechai, is that you are in a position where potentially, as a human being, from purely a human perspective, you have the ability to change the fate of the Jewish people. And at that moment, Esther understands that she has to move from a passive existence to an active existence. She understands that she cannot allow this mindset of Amalek to overcome her, this mindset of nothingness, of just whatever it will be, of fate to overcome her. And she says, go and gather all the Jews, and if I lose, if I have to give myself up, if I have to sacrifice for my people, that is what I'm going to do. That again is very much the idea of taking agency, of recognizing the covenantal role of the human being within the historical trajectory when God is not present, when we don't hear a voice of God telling us exactly what to do. And that again is the response to Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin. Is God amongst us? Is God within us? What are we going to do? Can we be free? Can we be free agents? Is God here even if we can't see him? And Esther responds to Mordechai and says, you know what? God is here. And I now am listening to that inner voice within, and I'm going to use the power of God within me to go and do what needs to be done. But she also adds something, which we're going to see in a second. She adds, everyone needs to fast for me, and everyone needs to be behind me. For Esther, it's not just about the individual act, it's about the web of community and support. And I remind you again, Moshe stands at the top of the mountain. Who is supporting his hands? Aaron and Hur. He's not doing it alone. And the message to the people also is you're not doing it alone. Covenantal living is not just me, the individual. Unfortunately, that was the repercussion, the corollary of the outlook that Nietzsche predicted, the death of God. It's only about me, it's only about the I, it's only about what's good for me. No, when we understand we're part of something much bigger. And now we get to crisis 3. And crisis 3, even though it's actually crisis 2 in your sheets, right? Crisis 3 is Richard Rubenstein. And Richard Rubenstein, and again, Megillah Esther, the people are about to be destroyed. A genocide is about to happen. Richard Rubenstein, in his case, the genocide did happen. And in our case, we're seeing day in, day out, and we, throughout the history of our modern state, have seen so many tragedies that have happened, and wars, and people who have died, and terror. And day in and day out, we ask ourselves, what's going on here? How can we respond to God not coming and saving us? God not coming down and redeeming us? And Rav Soloveitchik wrote an essay in 1956 called Fate and Destiny. And in that essay, he said as follows. Again, it really was the only thing he really wrote about the Holocaust. And in that, he outlines 2 different types of existence, an existence of fate and an existence of destiny. And here he speaks particularly about the idea of suffering, of the problem of evil. And he says, in an existence of fate, everything happens around me, I have no control. I can't do anything to change it, right? Terrible things happen, and I am passive. I'm passive. And the question I ask is why? Why has this happened to me? Why is this suffering come upon me? In an existence of destiny, of Ye'ud, instead of asking the why question, I ask, what does this summon me to do? Instead of being passive, I become active. Instead of saying, all of this has happened to me, instead of being a victim of my own condition, I become an agent of my future destiny. Listen to what he says. Judaism is always distinguished between an existence of fate and an existence of destiny. Between the I, which is the progeny of fate, and the I, which is the child of destiny. In this distinction lies hidden the Jewish doctrine of suffering. What is an existence of fate? It's an existence of duress. Against your will, you live out your life. It's factual, mechanical, devoid of meaning, direction, purpose, but subject to the forces of the environment unto which the individual has been cast by providence. I'm going to skip. What's the nature of the existence of destiny? Active mode of existence, where man confronts his environment into which he's thrown, possessing an understanding of his uniqueness, of his worth, of his freedom, and his ability to struggle with his external circumstances without forfeiting either his independence or selfhood. The motto of the eye of destiny is against your will. You're born against your will, you die, but you live through your free will. Man is born an object, dies like an object, but possesses the ability to live like a subject, a creator, an innovator. And says Rav Soloveitchik, Judaism's mission is to turn an existence of fate into an existence of destiny. Who were Amalek? Who is Haman? Amalek comes to us and we're told, if you look at source number 10, what does that mean? He chanced upon you on the way. Again, if you look, sorry, next source number 11. If you look, where's the word kerchacha come from? So if we look at the tocha of the time in the Torah where Hashem says to us, bad things are going to happen. Why? Because if you walk with me by happenstance, I'll walk with you by happenstance. If you look at Rashi and you look at Chizkuni, everybody, I'm not going to go into all the sources, but you can do the homework on your own when you get home. All the sources suggest that the characteristic of Amalek, and hence the characteristic of Haman, was the characteristic or the mindset, the philosophy of chance, of fate. It happens, everything happens, we have no control. And what's the outgrowth of that outlook? The outgrowth of that outlook is nothingness, is the death of God, is Nietzsche, is that feeling of being in absolute chaos, of disorder, of whatever's going to be is going to be. I am just a victim of my conditions, of the environment, of everything that's happening around me, and I have no control. And Amalek, very much, that was the mindset. There is no God, there's nothing transcendent, there's nothing that provides meaning. Amalek says, we will do what's in our self-interest. We want to attack them from behind with all the weaklings. We're going to do that because it serves our interest. Haman, what serves my interest? What serves my ego? To kill Mordechai and all his people. Why? Because he didn't bow down to me. Because I believe that I am the most important thing, and he didn't bow down to me. I'm going to serve my interest to kill them all. And when does he do it? He does it through a pool. What is a pool? What is Purim? A lot of fate, just random, nothingness. That is the mindset of Haman. And what Rav Soloveitchik says to us is, that mindset is a mindset that leads to disaster. It leads to disaster because ultimately what it does is it creates a sense of victimhood. There is a big difference between victimization and victimhood. Victimization is when you are the victim of something that happened to you, but victimhood is something that happens to me. Victimhood is something I have within myself. I make myself into a victim. Haman made himself into the victim of Mordechai. Mordechai didn't bow down to him. He felt as if there was nothing in his life. He turns around to his wife and says, all of this is worth nothing to me because he hasn't bowed down to me. He worships his ego. That is all that is important to him. The only person that can redeem you from your victimhood is yourself. And what I think is going on here is this, and this takes us back to the third crisis of Richard Rubenstein. Richard Rubenstein turns around and says the death of God. Why? Because God didn't save us in the Holocaust, right? The death of God because whatever. What Richard Rubenstein is saying is, we look at the world with very set out categories. God should save me. God didn't save me. We're the chosen people, and therefore I need to reject him. Rav Soloveitchik says like this. He reframes the whole thing. And he says that, in a sense, what Richard Rubenstein is doing is making himself the victim. And that way of thinking serves no purpose. Instead of asking the why, when we only focus on the why, when we only focus on the passiveness of our victimhood, ultimately we sink. And it leads to a sense of nothingness. Almost we buy in to the Amalekia mindset. Instead, says Rav Soloveitchik, we have to leave behind that question of why. And we have to ask the question of, what does this summon me to do? That is the question Mordechai asks. The people have been given a decree of genocide. It looks as if tomorrow they're all going to be killed. And Mordechai tears his clothes, he cries out, and he turns around and he says, what does this summon us to do? He goes to Esther and he says to her, what does you being in that position summon you to do? What he does in that moment is to move from a mindset of fate to a mindset of destiny, is to move from a mindset of passiveness to a mindset of agency. At that moment, he understands more than ever that covenant and our relationship with God doesn't mean that God's going to come down and save us every single time. On the contrary, it means that when God is not there, it's not that he's not there. It's that he's calling on us. He's calling on us to take agency. I want to read you Edith Eger from The Choice. Edith Eger is a Holocaust survivor, and I want to read you what she says about victimhood. My own search for freedom, my years of experience as a licensed psychologist have taught me that suffering is universal, but victimhood is optional. There's a difference between victimization and victimhood. We're all likely to be victimized in some way in the course of our lives. At some point, we'll suffer from kinds of affliction or calamity or abuse caused by circumstances or by people or by institutions over which we have little or no control. This is life, and this is victimization. It comes from the outside. It's the neighborhood bully, the boss who rages, the spouse who hits, the lover who cheats, the discriminatory law, the accident that lands you in hospital. In contrast, victimhood comes from the inside. No one can make you a victim but you. We become victims not because of what happens to us, not because of what happens to us, but when we choose to hold on to our victimizations. We develop a victim's mind, a way of thinking and being that is rigid, blaming, pessimistic, stuck in the past, unforgiving, punitive, and without healthy limits or boundaries. We become our own jailers when we choose the confines of the victim's mind. And again, I remind you of Haman. Mordechai doesn't bow down to him. Straight away, he asks Ahasuerus to get rid of all the Jews. And if you look as well, 1 minute. Why is my source sheet so messed up? 1 second. Does everyone have? Oh, okay. Look at source number 17. He leaves. וחראות המן אל מרדכי בשער המלך ולא קם ולא זע ממנו וימלא המן על מרדכי חמן ויתאפק המן ויבוא לבית וישלח ויבוא אוהביו ואת זרש אשתו ויספר להמן את כבוד השבוע ורוב בניו ואת כל אשר גדלו המלך ואת אשר נשאו. He turns around, he says, I'm the top, I've got everything, the king, I'm the second in command to king, everything is in my favor, but what? Look at Pasuk Gimel. B'chol ze enenu shaveh li b'chol et asher ani ro'eh Mordechai Yehudi yoshev b'sha'ar melech. But none of this is worth anything to me because Mordechai won't bow down. Haman is trapped. He is a victim of his own ego. He's a victim of his own fate outlook. He has bought in so much to his fatalistic outlook, he's become the victim of it. That he can't get past it and he can't make meaning in his life and he can't see the good and he can't see the transcendent and he can't see anything beyond the I and the ego. The response to suffering, the response to Richard Rubinstein is there are two ways of looking at the problem of evil and the Shoah. And again, I am not saying that this is an answer. This is exactly the point. Rav Soloveitchik in Kol Dodi Dofek does not give us an answer to why the Shoah happened. He does not give us an answer to why God seemingly didn't come down and save us. Instead, what he does is he offers us a way of living with the situation. And the way of living with the situation parallels everything we've seen till now. It parallels the idea of the people having to fight Amalek as a response to Hayesh Hashem b'Kobenu im Iyun, because God is saying to them, understand the power of your own individual strength. Understand that you can fight for God. You don't need God to fight for yourselves. You have that power. You look up to heaven, I'm with you. And when you know I'm with you, you can fight. David and Goliath, 1967 war. How is it? They don't even, I heard like in these military classes in America, they don't even teach the military tactic of 1967. Why? Because they say, what do they say? No, seriously, it was a miracle. Okay, it's true. I heard it from someone who learns there. They don't even teach it because they say it was so beyond, it just didn't. Why was it a miracle? Because yes, from the eyes of human beings, we look at it and we say, it was human beings and what, but it was literally the battle with Amalek. Moshe's hands were raised in the air and the people were looking up to heaven, even the most secular. They had that drive of Tselem Elokim within them. That's what God is saying to the people. You can do it, right? It's a bit like someone said to me at the end of the other show I gave, it's like Nike, just do it, right? You can do it. Here again, that's the response to the Hayesh Hashem b'Kobenu. And if there's nothingness, no, there's not nothingness. When you align yourself with a sense of transcendence, there will always be meaning. And that meaning will allow you to take agency, and that agency will allow you to work in a covenantal way to fix the world. That's number one. But here It's even deeper than that, because it's a moment in which Richard Rubenstein says, but the genocide happened and God didn't save us. And here Rav Soloveitchik turns around and he says, we can't say why, but what we can say is, how do we respond? How do we respond? How do we say, what does this summon me to do? And then Rav Soloveitchik says that there are 7 knocks on the door, and he gives over his Zionist propaganda and says we should all be going to Eretz Yisrael and building the state and living in Eretz Yisrael and making sure that we are an independent people in our state. And I want to bring to you a very poignant quote from Harold Kushner in his book When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Harold Kushner lost his son at a very young age to an absolutely awful disease, terrible disease. And he wrote this book afterwards, and he spoke about the idea of the prominent youth. And listen to what he says. How does God make a difference in our lives if he neither kills nor cures? God inspires people to help others who have been hurt by life. And by helping them, they protect them from the danger of feeling alone, abandoned, or judged. God makes some people want to become doctors and nurses, to spend days and nights of self-sacrifice and concern with an intensity for which no money can compensate, in the effort to sustain life and alleviate pain. God, who neither causes nor prevents tragedies, helps by inspiring people to help. As a 19th century Hasidic rabbi once put it, human beings are God's language. God shows his opposition to cancer and birth defects, not by eliminating them or making them happen only to bad people, but by summoning forth friends and neighbors to ease the burden and to fill the emptiness, Remember the emptiness that Nietzsche speaks about. Remember the emptiness that the people talk about. And finally, to the person who asks, what good is God? Who needs religion if these things happen to good people and bad people alike? I would say that God may not prevent the calamity, but he gives us the strength and the perseverance to overcome it. Where else do we get these qualities, which we did not have before? The flood that devastates a town is not an act of God, even if insurance companies find it useful to call that. But the efforts people make to save lives, risking their own lives for a person who might be a total stranger to them, and the determination to rebuild their community after the flood waters have receded, do qualify as acts of God. Esther turns round and she says, Lech knos et kol hayudim hanimseim b'Shushan v'tzumo alai v'al tachlu v'al tishtu shlosha yamim laila v'yom v'gam ani v'norati etzum ken u'v'chen avol hamelach shel lo kadat v'chasher avadati. What possesses Esther until that moment in survival mode, only self-interested, only wanting to make sure that she does not suffer, to put herself at the greatest risk and ask the people, many of whom she doesn't even feel connected to because she never identified as a Jew, to share her own destiny with her. Because exactly as Harold Kushner says, and exactly as Rav Soloveitchik says, there are moments in which things happen to us that are beyond our control. And the only thing that we can do is to ask, what does this summon me? It's happened. The why question may never be answered. Richard Rubenstein may say the death of God, but we as human beings can respond. And I think that I'm gonna not finish with Rabbi Sachs. You're gonna read it on your own, okay? But what I've been trying to show you is that the 3 different Christs that we've seen over our history all start at the same point. God is not revealed on a day-to-day. Therefore, where do we find him? And the greatest answer comes from Megillah Esther. When Mordechai says, "Umi yodem le'et kazot," he's saying, I live in a post-revelatory world. I do not know where God is. I don't know what is going on. I'm in chaos. I'm in a total moment of non-certainty, of uncertainty. And yet I'm calling on you, Estelle, to make destiny from fate, agency from passiveness, and to change the outcome of the people's Gzeirah, of the decree of Haman. And Esther does it, and that is the Purim story, and a story for us at every moment of crisis in the history of the Jewish people, and human story as well. Thank you.
No, I heard it. Oh, shoot.
Let's go back.